Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your most trusted colleague, the person you've shared secrets with for decades, has been feeding every piece of intelligence straight to your greatest enemy. Now imagine that happening not once, but dozens of times, on both sides of an invisible war that shaped the fate of humanity. This is not fiction. This is the story of the greatest intelligence war ever fought, a shadow conflict between two superpowers that turned the entire world into a chessboard, where spies were the pieces, secrets were the currency, and one wrong move could trigger nuclear annihilation. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended, and the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, forged in the fires of defeating Nazi Germany, is already crumbling in the ruins of Berlin. American and Soviet soldiers stand on opposite sides of what will soon become the most heavily fortified border in history. But the real battle isn't happening in the streets. It's happening in the shadows, in the secret meetings, in the encrypted cables, in the minds of men and women who have chosen to live double lives. The Cold War has begun, and with it, the most intense intelligence conflict the world has ever seen. Washington and Moscow both understood something fundamental. Whoever controlled information would control the future. The atomic bomb had changed everything. Both nations knew that the next war wouldn't be won by the side with the most tanks or soldiers. It would be won by the side that knew what the enemy was planning before they could act. And so, in the aftermath of World War II, two intelligence empires began to rise. In America, the Office of Strategic Services transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, tasked with one mission above all others: know everything the Soviets are doing, everywhere, all the time. In Moscow, the NKVD evolved into the KGB, a vast apparatus of surveillance, espionage, and covert action that would become one of the most feared intelligence agencies in history. What made this intelligence war different from anything that came before was its scale and sophistication. This wasn't just about stealing military plans or planting a few spies in enemy territory. This was total intelligence warfare. Both sides recruited thousands of agents, built global networks of informants, developed cutting-edge technology for surveillance and communication, and poured billions into operations that ranged from the brilliant to the bizarre. The CIA and KGB weren't just intelligence agencies. They were invisible armies fighting a war that most people didn't even know was happening. The battlefield was everywhere. In the divided city of Berlin, American and Soviet intelligence officers played cat and mouse in the rubble, each side trying to recruit the other's agents, each side trying to tunnel under the other's communications lines. In London, Soviet spies had penetrated the highest levels of British intelligence, feeding Moscow secrets that gave them a devastating advantage. In Washington, the hunt for communist infiltrators became an obsession, tearing apart careers and lives in the paranoid search for the enemy within. And in thousands of cities across the globe, in embassies and universities and scientific institutions, intelligence officers worked under diplomatic cover, building networks, recruiting assets, and gathering the secrets that could shift the balance of power. The stakes were almost incomprehensibly high. Both nations possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. Every piece of intelligence could be the difference between peace and apocalypse. When would the other side launch? What were their military capabilities? Were they planning a first strike? These questions haunted both Washington and Moscow, and answering them became the obsessive focus of the intelligence war. The paranoia was mutual and reinforcing. The Americans believed the Soviets were planning world domination through communist revolution. The Soviets believed the Americans were planning to destroy them with a nuclear surprise attack. And both sides used their intelligence services to prepare for a conflict that, paradoxically, both desperately wanted to avoid. What emerged was a strange and deadly game. Both sides knew they were being spied on, so they fed disinformation to confuse the enemy. Both sides knew their communications were being intercepted, so they developed ever more complex codes and ciphers. Both sides knew their embassies were bugged, so they built secure rooms within rooms, swept for listening devices daily, and conducted sensitive conversations in the open air or with music playing to defeat hidden microphones. The intelligence war became a war of deception, where the truth was layered beneath lies, where every agent could be a double agent, and where even your greatest intelligence triumph might be exactly what the enemy wanted you to believe. And the human cost was staggering. Spies who were caught faced execution or life imprisonment. Defectors who fled to the other side left behind families they would never see again. Double agents lived in constant fear of exposure, knowing that discovery meant certain death. Innocent people were swept up in spy scandals, their lives destroyed by association or suspicion. Entire communities were torn apart by the paranoia and fear that the intelligence war generated. This wasn't a clean, romantic vision of espionage from the movies. This was brutal, messy, and morally ambiguous. A war fought in the gray zones where patriotism and betrayal, duty, and conscience were often impossible to separate. The opening moves of this intelligence were set patterns that would define the entire Cold War. By the early 1950s, both sides had achieved significant penetrations of each other as governments, and were locked in an escalating cycle of espionage and counter-espionage. The question was no longer whether there would be an intelligence war, but how far each side was willing to go, and what they were willing to sacrifice to win it. The first major shockwave came from an unexpected place. Britain, America's closest ally, had been compromised at the highest levels. In 1951, to British diplomats, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean suddenly vanished from London and resurfaced in Moscow. They weren't just any diplomats. Maclean had been privy to atomic secrets and high-level policy discussions. Burgess had connections throughout the intelligence establishment. The revelation was devastating. They were part of what would later be known as the Cambridge Five, a ring of Soviet spies recruited at Cambridge University in the 1930s, who had risen to positions of extraordinary influence in British intelligence and government. The mastermind, Kim Philby, had been the British liaison to both the CIA and FBI, meaning he had access to virtually every major Western intelligence operation against the Soviet Union. The damage was catastrophic for years. The Soviets had known about Western intelligence operations before they even began. Agents sent behind the Iron Curtain were captured and executed because Moscow knew they were coming. Technical operations were compromised. Strategic plans were exposed. The Cambridge Five represented perhaps the greatest intelligence penetration in history, and it sent shockwaves through the American and British intelligence communities. If the Soviets could penetrate that deeply, who else might be working for them? The paranoia intensified, and the hunt for moles became an obsession that would consume both sides for decades. But the Americans had their own secrets to protect and their own traitors to fear. The Soviet Union had successfully placed agents deep within the American atomic bomb program during World War II. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working on the Manhattan Project, had passed detailed information about the bomb's design to Soviet handlers. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg ran a spy ring that funneled atomic secrets to Moscow. These espionage operations accelerated the Soviet nuclear program by years, perhaps by as much as a decade, when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949. Years ahead of American expectations, it became clear that espionage had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The nuclear monopoly that American planners had counted on to keep the Soviets in check had evaporated, thanks in large part to intelligence operations. The intelligence war evolved rapidly as both sides developed new techniques and technologies. The CIA pioneered the use of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, culminating in the U-2 plane, which could fly at 70,000 feet, far above Soviet air defenses, and photographed military installations with unprecedented detail. These flights gave American analysts crucial intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. revealing that the feared bomber gap and later the missile gap were largely illusions, created by Soviet propaganda and American anxiety. But in 1960, a U-2 pilot named Francis Gary Powers was shot down deep inside Soviet territory. The Soviets paraded him in front of cameras, and the Eisenhower administration's initial denials collapsed when Moscow produced both the pilot and the wreckage. The incident was a massive embarrassment that nearly derailed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Technology became increasingly central to the intelligence war. Both sides raced to develop better surveillance equipment, more sophisticated code-breaking computers, and more effective communications systems. The National Security Agency, created in 1952, focused on signals intelligence, intercepting and decoding Soviet communications. The Soviets developed their own signals intelligence capabilities, tapping phone lines, intercepting radio transmissions, and even finding ways to pick up the electronic emissions from typewriters and computer screens in what became known as Operation Gold. The CIA and British intelligence built a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin to tap Soviet military communication lines. For nearly a year, the operation provided valuable intelligence until the KGB discovered it. What the Americans didn't know until decades later was that the KGB had known about the tunnel from the beginning thanks to another mole in British intelligence, George Blake, but had allowed it to operate to protect Blake's cover. The intelligence war also played out in spectacular acts of tradecraft and deception. Dead drops, where spies left materials at prearranged locations for pickup by handlers, became standard procedure. Invisible ink, microdots containing photographed documents reduced to the size of a printed period, and elaborate codes filled the toolkit of both sides. Spies developed elaborate cover identities, sometimes living for years as ordinary citizens while secretly gathering intelligence. The KGB became masters of what they called illegals, agents who assumed false identities in Western countries, with no connection to Soviet diplomatic missions, making them much harder to detect. Defections became another critical battlefield. When a high-ranking intelligence officer defected to the other side, they brought with them not just information, but insights into methods, personnel, and ongoing operations. Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer, provided the CIA and British intelligence with crucial information about Soviet missile capabilities during the early 1960s. His intelligence was instrumental during the Cuban Missile Crisis, helping President Kennedy understand Soviet intentions and capabilities. When the KGB discovered Penkovsky's betrayal, he was arrested, tried, and executed. But the information he provided may have helped prevent nuclear war. On the American side, defections to the Soviet Union were rarer, but equally damaging. Each defector, in either direction, triggered a wave of reassessments, security reviews, and paranoid speculation about who else might be compromised. By the 1960s, the intelligence war had settled into patterns of operation that both sides understood. They knew they would spy on each other. They knew they would try to recruit each other's officers. They knew they would run technical operations, human operations, and everything in between. What they didn't know was just how deeply each side had penetrated the other, or how much the intelligence war would escalate in the decades to come. The intelligence war reached new levels of intensity during the 1970s and 80s, a period when both superpowers refined their methods and achieved penetrations that would only be fully understood decades later. While détente created an illusion of reduced tensions on the surface, beneath it the spy war intensified. Both the CIA and KGB recognized that human intelligence, the old-fashioned business of recruiting spies and running agents, remained irreplaceable despite all the technological advances. And it was in this realm that some of the most damaging betrayals in intelligence history would occur. The KGB's approach to recruiting American spies evolved significantly during this period. They moved away from ideological recruitment, which had worked so well with the Cambridge 5 and atomic spies of the 1940s, toward exploiting personal weaknesses. Money, ego, resentment, and personal problems became the primary tools of recruitment. The KGB cultivated a patient, methodical approach, sometimes watching potential targets for years before making an approach. They study personnel files, financial records, psychological profiles, looking for the vulnerable, the disgruntled, the greedy, and they found them inside the CIA, inside the FBI, inside military intelligence, inside the most secure installations of the American intelligence establishment. Soviet handlers were running sources who had access to the crown jewels of American intelligence. The CIA, meanwhile, was achieving its own successes behind the Iron Curtain. Throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the agency ran networks of agents who provided intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, and technological developments. Some were motivated by ideology, believing that communism had failed and that the West represented humanity's best hope. Others were motivated by money or by personal grievances against the Soviet system. The CIA developed sophisticated methods for communicating with agents in hostile territory, from shortwave radio broadcasts containing coded messages to elaborate dead-drop systems. But running agents in the Soviet Union was extraordinarily dangerous. The KGB's counterintelligence capabilities were formidable, and the penalty for espionage was death. One of the most significant developments of this period was the increasing role of technology in enabling espionage. Satellites revolutionized intelligence gathering, providing detailed imagery of Soviet military installations, troop movements, and weapons development. The CIA's Corona satellite program, begun in the late 1950s but reaching maturity in the following decades, produced more photographic intelligence than all previous aerial reconnaissance combined. The Soviets developed their own satellite reconnaissance capabilities, though they generally lagged behind American technology. But satellites couldn't do everything. They couldn't tell you what Soviet leaders were thinking, couldn't reveal the existence of classified programs conducted indoors, couldn't provide the context and analysis that only human sources could deliver. The intelligence war also extended into Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion in 1979. The CIA, working primarily through Pakistani intelligence, provided weapons, training, and funding to the Afghan Mujahideen resistance. This became one of the largest covert operations in CIA history, eventually funneling billions of dollars in support. The program included providing advanced weapons like Stinger missiles that allowed the Mujahideen to shoot down Soviet helicopters and aircraft, fundamentally changing the nature of the conflict. The KGB, meanwhile, conducted its own operations in Afghanistan, trying to identify and eliminate resistance leaders, running disinformation campaigns, and attempting to sow discord among the various Mujahideen groups. Afghanistan became a proxy battlefield, where the intelligence services of both superpowers fought through intermediaries, each trying to shape the outcome without triggering direct confrontation. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the intelligence war during this period was how thoroughly each side had been penetrated by the other, something that wouldn't become clear until later. In the CIA, Aldrich Ames, a career intelligence officer with access to Soviet operations, had been recruited by the KGB in 1985. His betrayal was catastrophic. Ames revealed the identities of virtual, every significant CIA source inside the Soviet Union. Within months, the Soviets arrested and executed at least 10 agents working for the Americans. The CIA knew something was terribly wrong when their sources began disappearing, but it would take years to identify Ames as the mole. His betrayal represented one of the most damaging intelligence failures in American history. At the same time, the FBI had its own nightmare unfolding. Robert Hanssen, an FBI counterintelligence officer whose job was literally to catch Soviet spies, had himself been spying for the KGB since 1979. Hansen's position gave him access to extraordinarily sensitive information about American intelligence methods, ongoing operations, and technical capabilities. He compromised numerous operations and revealed the identities of Soviet officials, cooperating with American intelligence. What made Hansen's treachery particularly galling was that he continued spying even after the Cold War ended, motivated primarily by money and perhaps by the thrill of deception. He wouldn't be caught until 2001, making him one of the longest-serving moles in American intelligence history. The damage these moles inflicted went beyond the immediate compromise of sources and operations. They created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia within the intelligence services themselves. If officers like Ames and Hansen could betray their countries, who else might be compromised? The mole hunts that followed consumed enormous resources and destroyed careers of innocent officers who fell under suspicion. Trust, the foundation of any intelligence service, was shattered, and both sides faced the same problem. The KGB had its own traitors, Soviet intelligence officers who had been recruited by the CIA and were providing Moscow's secrets to Washington. The intelligence war had become a hall of mirrors where no one could be entirely certain who was working for whom. The final years of the intelligence war unfolded against the backdrop of the Soviet Union's collapse, a development that caught much of the Western intelligence community by surprise despite decades of intensive surveillance and analysis. Throughout the late 1980s, as Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, the CIA struggled to assess whether these reforms represented genuine change or merely tactical adjustments. The KGB itself was divided, with hardliners viewing Gorbachev's openness as a betrayal while others recognized that the Soviet system was unsustainable. The intelligence war continued even as the political structures that had created it began to crumble. As the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Eastern European communist regimes collapsed in rapid succession, and both intelligence services faced an identity crisis, the CIA had been built to counter the Soviet threat, and suddenly the threat was disappearing. When the final coup attempt by hardliners failed in August 1991, and the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December, the intelligence war that had defined nearly half a century came to an abrupt end, or so it seemed. The aftermath revealed just how extensive the intelligence war had been. As archives opened and former intelligence officers published memoirs, the full scope of operations on both sides became clear. Thousands of agents had been run by both sides. Tens of billions of dollars had been spent. Countless lives had been destroyed. The CIA's successful recruitment of Soviet military officers who provided crucial information during critical moments. The KGB's penetration of Western intelligence services that had compromised operations for decades. The close calls, the near misses, the operations that almost succeeded and those that failed spectacularly. What became clear in retrospect was that intelligence had played a crucial role in preventing the Cold War from turning hot. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, intelligence provided by sources like Oleg Penkovsky helped American leaders understand Soviet capabilities and intentions, enabling them to navigate the crisis without triggering nuclear war. Throughout the Cold War, intelligence helped both sides avoid miscalculations that could have led to catastrophic conflict. The intelligence war, for all its costs and moral ambiguities, may have helped save the world from nuclear annihilation. But the intelligence war also revealed the dangers of secrecy and the corrosive effects of suspicion. Both societies paid a price for the paranoia that the spy war generated. In America, the fear of communist infiltration led to McCarthyism and the destruction of innocent lives. In the Soviet Union, the KGB's power created a surveillance state where millions lived in fear. The intelligence services on both sides sometimes operated beyond the control of democratic oversight, conducting operations that violated their own nation's stated values. The human stories that emerged after the Cold War were particularly striking. Former enemies met and sometimes developed grudging respect for each other's professionalism. KGB officers who had spent careers trying to destroy the CIA sat down with their former adversaries, to discuss their operations. Some spies who had betrayed their countries expressed remorse, while others remained defiant. The intelligence officers who had hunted moles for years finally learned the full extent of how thoroughly they had been penetrated. The picture that emerged was complex, morally ambiguous, and deeply human. The legacy of the US versus USSR intelligence war continues to shape global politics today. Russia's intelligence services, successors to the KGB, remain formidable adversaries of Western intelligence. The spy war never truly ended. It simply evolved. New technologies, from cyber operations to artificial intelligence, have created new battlefields for intelligence conflict, but the fundamental dynamics remain recognizable. Nations seeking to know their adversaries' secrets, while protecting their own, using both human agents and technical systems, operating in the shadows while shaping events in the light. The intelligence war between the United States and Soviet Union was one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century, fought not with armies and navies but with secrets and lies, courage and betrayal, brilliant operations and catastrophic failures. It was a war where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of human civilization, where individual decisions by intelligence officers could alter the course of history, and where the line between patriot and traitor was sometimes impossibly thin. Understanding this shadow conflict is essential to understanding the Cold War itself and the world we live in today. If you found this deep dive into the secret war between superpowers fascinating, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we have so much more to uncover. From the most daring escape attempts across the Iron Curtain to the technological innovations that changed espionage forever, from the double agents who played both sides to the operations that almost started World War III, this channel is your gateway into the hidden world of intelligence warfare. Drop a comment below telling us which spy story you want us to cover next. Was it the true story behind a famous spy movie? A particular operation that changed history? A legendary intelligence officer whose name deserves to be known? Your suggestions drive our content. And if you really want to support what we do here, consider joining our membership program, where you get early access to videos, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and deep dives that go even further into the rabbit hole of espionage history. The intelligence war may have ended, but the stories are just beginning. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next operation.